my recording as well. Okay, very good. So, all right, so let's go ahead and I'll share my screen in 1 second. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off and mute myself for the next 5 minutes. It's because, well, we don't.
Is a mini wheat really a mini wheat without frosting?
It's an unfrosted mini wheat, Dad, with cocoa.
New unfrosted cocoa mini wheat
Hold on,
cereal.
babe. Sorry, I'm
high
just
in fiber.
In the 1980s, cartoonist Alison Bechdel observed a frustrating trend in pop culture. Most films only had a single female character, and when there were multiple women in a film, their storylines almost always revolved around men.
Just call him. Say hello. He's in my book club. Why is there a woman in this picture? It's his wife.
This realization inspired her to create a comic called The Rule. I only go to a movie if it satisfies 3 basic requirements. 1, it has to have at least 2 women in it, who 2, talk to each other, about 3, something besides a man. These requirements form the foundation of the Bechdel test, which has become a tool used to call attention to gender inequality in pop culture. For example, this scene fails the Bechdel test.
Who's Alan's friend? Hugh. He's a bit of a cad, actually. So my type, then.
While this scene passes it.
You have no style or sense of fashion.
Well, I think that depends on what you're...
No. That wasn't a question.
Bechdel credits the idea for the test to her friend Liz Wallace, who was inspired by Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. Woolf writes, "All these relationships between women are too simple, and I tried to remember any case in the course of my reading where 2 women are represented as friends. They are now and then mothers and daughters, but almost without exception, they are shown in their relation to men."
Whatever we do, we always want to look our very best. I mean, why imagine if our husbands saw us in worn, dark, urban sweat clothes with stringy hair and almost no makeup.
Even though Woolf's essay is over 90 years old, limited female representation in pop culture persists today. A survey of 120 films by the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media revealed that only 31% of the named characters were female, and 23% of the films had a female protagonist or co-protagonist.
Okay, I'm a lady, she's a lady, you're a lady, we're the ladies.
The website BechdelTest.com is a user-generated list of over 6,500 films that catalogs which films pass the test, with the added requirement that the female characters must be named. And while the requirements to pass might seem simple, there are an enormous amount of very successful films that fail.
We're ranking girls. We know there's students. Yeah.
As the Bechdel test gained popularity, it also became the subject of intense scrutiny, because some people assumed that films that failed the test were automatically considered bad. Bechdel never intended for the test to be a way to comment on the quality of a film, and she admits that her favorite film doesn't pass the test.
I don't really follow this scheme in my real life.
What's your favorite movie?
Groundhog Day.
Groundhog Day does not pass the Bechdel test.
Majorly fails.
Majorly fails the Groundhog Day.
Another important distinction to make is that the Bechdel test is not a way to evaluate whether a film is feminist. For example, the film Gravity fails the Bechdel test, while Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back music video does pass the test.
Oh my God, Becky, look at her butt.
Andy Zeisler, co-founder of Bitch Media, wrote of the test, "Bechdel and Wallace expressed it as simply a way to point out the rote, unthinkingly normative plot lines of mainstream film. It was never meant to be a measure of feminism, but rather a cultural barometer." What Zeisler means is that the Bechdel test is most effective when applied on a universal level. When hundreds of successful films struggle to pass the requirements, it's important to reflect on how this impacts the way audiences are conditioned to think about women. Says NPR's Netta Ulaby about the test.
It articulates something often missing in popular culture. Not the number of women we see on screen, but the depth of their stories and the range of their concerns.
You're good at hiding stuff, huh?
My mom calls it compartmentalizing. Apparently I do that a lot.
Bechdel's test has inspired others to create their own tests based on race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Other tests being developed through 538.com look at the diversity of the crews making up these projects. And hopefully by continuing to give creative power to women, audiences will be exposed to even more complex, compelling, and relatable stories of female friendship and accomplishments.
Thank you for getting me into the league, Daddy.
You got yourself in the league. I got you on the train.
In 2017, the top 3 grossing films all passed the Bechdel test with flying colors. So even though gender inequality is still prevalent, progress is being made. And the characters from Bechdel's original comic would have more options at the box office today than they did in 1985.
Mute. There you go. So the Bechdel test it's an example of an observation guide that helps viewers like us and researchers look at the gender representation in films. And as we understood from the video, you're watching films or clips of films to see whether they have at least 2 female characters who talk to each other about something other than a man. So basically removing the representation of women in the context of men alone. It's a very interesting and simple observation guide. And so, you know, this is I just thought we'd show you this film just to understand that even when we make observations, they need to be contextualized and there need to be rules laid down. What we'll do now, and this will get clearer as we go through the questions at the end of the chapter. So this is the end of chapter, I believe it's chapter 7. No, chapter 6. It's lecture 7, but chapter 6. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing. Not because I don't mind sharing, but we will finish the questions and then move on to the next slide. Now, one of the things that Cassidy has a comment, so I'll address that. Cassidy has seen the Bechdel test before. I believe it's in her psych courses. No, she took a course called News, Pop Culture, and Power, and she was shocked because she never realized, but she notices this all the time. I'll tell you something funny, and this I don't know I think since you're all women here, you can relate to the fact that this is highly inaccurate of women's lives and how they're depicted in the majority of films. What was interesting to me is when I came to the US about 22 years ago, I had seen several Hollywood films, but I was typically my issue was I couldn't relate to the protagonist, to the culture and to the lifestyle. So while I enjoyed the films, I could never picture someone that looked like me in any of them. Okay, because it didn't make any sense, and their realities were so different. So it just says that, you know, things are presented from a certain context, and unless you know what you're looking for, and you actually identify and specify it, you could be watching stuff, but you don't necessarily pick up on a lot of different cues. Cassidy says, even in the newer TV show called Stranger Things, it demonstrates this protecting women attitude. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Very, very interesting stuff. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll go to the back of your textbook and try to answer as many questions as we can before we move on to selecting a research design. All right. So again, responses are all welcome. You can put your hand up and respond, or you can go in the chat window. Obviously, putting your hand up and responding is more of a direct response. And what this helps me gauge as well is how much you are grabbing out of the content and whether you're up with your readings or not. So I kind of have a sense for where each student is at. So please don't feel shy. There is no wrong answer. So, okay. And if you don't want to give me a specific answer, you can point out the page of your textbook where you think the answer is, and that will work as a response as well. So if you have your textbook handy, that's fine. So let's look at the first question for review. What are the basic steps in preparing to do research involving observation as a data gathering technique? So what are the steps you have to do when you're using observation? What are the basic steps? Steph?
I had select concepts, select variables, select a means for measuring those variables, and design a means for recording the measurements you will make.
100%. Great answer, Steph. Just like Steph said, the logic of measurement remains the same. Now, if you want something very specific for observation, you can go to page 95 of your textbook. So when you go to page 95, what it does is, where is it? There we go. It provides a little bit of a checklist for research involving observation and quantitative research. So that's if you get, I'm not saying this is a question on your midterm or your final, but if you get a question, which of the following would form the items on a checklist for observation studies? And then you have 6 things. So has everybody been able to locate the checklist? Does anybody have any difficulty finding it? There are 6 items on the checklist. The first one is clarifying and narrowing your hypothesis or research objective. So it's one step before what Steph suggested. Steph, you're absolutely right. It's just that when you make a checklist, so you start at the conceptual level, then identifying the variables, then identifying how each variable is to be measured. So all of the steps that you said. Then the 2 more things to add is practicing your checklist and reporting. How would you report your results? So if anybody has difficulty finding this answer, let me know, or put your hand up and we can help you track it down. But otherwise, it is on page 95. Okay. The next question is, what is the purpose of having a checklist for observation? Why should you have a checklist? Any guesses? Do we need a checklist to observe? And we spoke about this last time. We spoke about the example with disruptive behaviors, right? So, Tree?
I think it's good. I think that you know that you're ready once you've checked everything off the list. I don't know if you've ever done something where you've forgotten an important item and and then you can't move forward. But I think that if you have a checklist, you can be sure that you're prepared and ready to go.
Thank you, Tree. Yeah, and absolutely. So basically having a checklist kind of keeps you organized, keep you prepared. You're basically checking off boxes. You've already defined everything that you're measuring as a follow-up from question 1, and now you're checking things off. And so the purpose is that you don't miss observations. All your observations are clearly, all your definition of all your variables, things that can change, are already listed on your checklist, and then you're just going check, check, check. Now, there are examples in your textbook of what that looks like. So I believe, let's see, I'm gonna go. I believe page. Well, you have different kinds of checklists. So there's an observation checklist for analyzing a conversation. That's on page 99. And so just, I the example we were talking about, classroom behavior, is on page 97. So you have a little checklist. You have all the different behaviors that are indicative of distracted behavior. So you have pokes your neighbor, talks out of turn. Number 3 is whispers, 4 is interrupts, 5 is gets up from desk, 6 takes a nap, 7 throws something, 8 is teases, and so on. So it just keeps you on track, and that's the point of a checklist. Now, checklist, it's one thing to have it well defined in terms of classroom disruptive behavior. You might also need a checklist for something else, like a conversation. So, for example, there's a familial conversation, and you have a sense that people who are of one gender are ignored or mocked, ridiculed, or their voice is not as important. So you sit with a different kind of an observation checklist for analyzing a conversation. And what you do there is it's a little bit more loose. So if you go to page 99, you can see this. And well, let me see if I can share this so you're not necessarily flipping through pages. Let's make it simple. Okay, everyone can see my screen now? Okay. So when you have a checklist of this sort, especially the figure 6.4, if you can't see figure 6.4, let me know. And if you can, that's perfect. Okay. So these tables typically tend to have these columns blank. These guys tend to be blank because you don't know what's going to get discussed. You're observing a conversation with the general idea that it's a group in which some people get ignored more than others. And every time they give the example of Allie and John, we will assume that Allie is representing a female and John is a male. And depending on who is speaking, either their opinion is rejected, so they're seeing what happens when Allie tries to get into the conversation. So depending on what the topic is, there are different observations being made. Again, these are mock examples, so they're not necessarily, saying anything here. But so this would be the example of an observation checklist when you're observing for conversation. So they're a little bit different than having a predetermined list for classroom disruptive behavior. Okay. All right. What is the purpose of a data summation sheet? Why should we have a data summation sheet? Oh, I have something in the chat window. I misunderstood the question. Well, no worries. It's all good. Artika is responding to why do we need a summation sheet? Provides a systematic record of observation, 100%. So let's take the example of this sheet one more time. Let's say you have a sheet like this, okay? You have a sheet for Allie. Let's assume there are other females in the family or in the group. Let's say there's Melissa, there's Joan, there's Ashley. They are all going to have separate sheets, okay? Which means you can look at each sheet and identify whether, when their participation in each of these conversations, whether there was a rejection, whether there was a ridicule, whether they were being ignored, interrupted, discussed, praised, whatever be the case. And the issue with that is if you do this about 50 times, guess how many sheets you have? You have 50 sheets. You have lots of information now, but you have no quick way to assess whether in this setting, females are typically ignored. You have to have a quick way to look at all that data. And that's where the summation sheet comes up. Now, a summation sheet will capture, it would be very similar, except what it would do is it would just say, to identify that you're measuring what happens to females participating in conversations, and then you would sum up what you're seeing in different sheets. So you'd sum up the incidences of rejection, the incidences of ridicule, ignored, some adoption, some praise, based on the topic. And again, I'm making these up, but what that does is, yeah, you may probably not leave the checks in there. You may go ahead and sum it up, and you may just say, okay, you know what, we're just going to say 5, we're going to say 0, we're going to say 2, 1, 1, 1, 0, and so on. So what a summation sheet does in essence is it lets you look at the data in a much more in a summarized fashion, which is the role of a summation sheet. It's meant to be summarized. So you go ahead and get that information in a summarized way. That's the whole point of a summation sheet, so that you're not scrolling through sheets and sheets of paper. Moving forward, the data from a summation sheet may be put in the form of a table, and the table might be represented as a table itself or as a graph. And that's something for the researcher to decide if that is what they want to do. All right, next question is, what are the basic steps in preparing research involving the use of a questionnaire or an interview schedule? Now, we covered this in lecture as well, but just for your memory, if you want to know where it is, that is on page 103. So we'll just go over to page 103. So here are some helpful hints for writing questionnaires that ask the respondent questions of a fact, then questions about opinions and attitudes. So it kind of summarizes what we spoke about, clarify what it is that you want to know and why you're asking the question. So this is for the researcher to do with themselves. We won't read the whole thing out because I know for a fact that all of you can read this up for yourself. But those are the 2 pages that you need, which goes through the list of things. Again, if you were to speculate on what a question for this might look like, you may get a question saying, these are the things that are important when creating a questionnaire or an interview, and you might have 4 or 5 things there. There might be one thing that is obviously not true, and you may have to pick the one that's wrong or check all the ones that are right, one or the other. Okay. Question 5 is, what is the difference between an interview schedule and a questionnaire? What's the difference between an interview schedule and a questionnaire? Anybody? Are they different? So an interview schedule is a bunch of questions that you have that you can pick some out for an interview. Okay. So what they do is you usually use pools of questions that have previously been used or that you've tested and used. So it's essentially a question bank for an interviewer to use, but they're all tried and true questions that measure one variable or the other. You don't typically have irrelevant questions in your interview schedule. The reason it's different from a questionnaire is you don't need a person administering a questionnaire to you typically, unless the person who's being administered the questionnaire is incapable of writing, or there are some challenges with the person being able to complete the questionnaire, and then it might be administered. But for the most part, questionnaires are handed out either physically on paper or electronically, and the person completes those themselves. Interview schedules, you actually have somebody conducting the interview, talking to you, recording your responses either on paper or audio, whatever be the case, okay? Okay. Question number 6, how do you determine the highest and lowest possible scores on a scale framed by responses to items to measure respondents' attitudes, values, or beliefs? So we're looking at attitudinal scales. Okay, an example of an attitudinal scale is, I believe, on page 107, but 105 and 106 talk about the attitudinal scales. They also go into detail on how you would assign the scores and so on. In this case, they use a Likert scale. If you can, well, I'm not sharing my screen, so you can't see it. So I'm going to just go ahead and do that. We have something in the chat window. Yeah, pull that up. Arthika says Likert scale, yes, 100%. So what you have to do is, how do you determine what's the highest and what's the lowest possible scale? And typically, when you go through the text, the idea is you need to have an increasing or a decreasing scale so that you can clearly measure the presence or absence of an attitude. So you can't have scores like, I don't know, 1, 2, 2.5, you can't assign scores, which would be something funky like this. You can't have, say, let's see if I can get my pen to work. There we go. You can't go 1.5. We go 3 here, 3.25. 5. Well, you get the idea. They have to be pretty standard, and the main idea, and nobody would do that in the normal world. You wouldn't. They are artificial numbers. So for example, suppose someone scores, this is a sexism attitude scale. A woman would never make a good judge. And let's say somebody says strongly disagree, and they get a 5, okay? Somebody else says disagree, and they get a 4, okay? So someone who disagrees that a woman would make a good judge, are they only 20% more sexist than the person who just said disagree? Or are they horribly more sexist than someone, or are they only, say, 40% more sexist than someone who's undecided, you know? So they're not accurate measures. Again, that's not what the question is about, but the point of the scale essentially is the idea that you can tell the difference. There aren't any claims on attitudinal assessments for the accuracy of a numerical value. Okay, so let's, all right. What does it mean to reverse the polarity of response for an item? Anybody? We spoke about this, but I would be totally psyched if I got a response on this one. What do you mean by reversing polarity? Anybody? Steph?
It's when you kind of change the question. So like, for example, in the sexism example, you make a statement like women would not make good judges. And then the next question you would say something like women should have equal opportunity in academia. And that the purpose of doing that is so that you catch people who are trying to who are lying, who are just sort of looking at the, they've kind of cottoned on that if they sort of strongly disagree or strongly agree, that they're kind of conveying that attitude, and it's to sort of catch those people out.
Right, and it's not, most of these surveys tend to be, even if they have an identification number, they're anonymous. So it's not that you're going to catch these people and say, hey, you sexist, I got you. It's not for that idea, but if you're measuring attitudes, you can get rid of those surveys because, unfortunately, because of the way these people have answered, they have not been honest and they're trying to game the system. An example is present on page 107. Question C is a case of reverse polarity. Okay, so look at all the other questions. A woman would never make a good judge. Okay, highly sexist person, strongly agree. Okay, that's what they'd pick. Okay. Women are not as good at sports as men. Strongly agree. Women should be encouraged to seek leadership positions. Now, if the person is not trying to game the system and they're truly honest when responding to this, they're going to check this, correct? But if they're either rushing through it or they're not really thinking and they're, basically, they might just go ahead and check this one. And those are the things that identify issues with the questions itself. Men should not have to wash dishes. Again, this is a reverse polarity question. These are all, you typically don't have so many reverse polarity. So what happens is the scores get, so it's important to understand that you may assign scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for these two questions. But for these, you might assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see how the numbers get flipped around when you make the final score? And that's the reversion of polarity. And there are many more examples. You'll find several more, but it's in our interest to move forward. Unless anyone has any questions so far? Any questions so far for any of the questions? Okay, crystal clear it is. Okay, what are the steps in preparing to do research involving the use of content analysis? So, as Stephanie had previously mentioned for the observation requirements to do an observational study, the requirements for any study are typically the same. You identify the concepts, you identify which concept you're planning to study, you identify the variable you're going to measure, you identify the measuring instrument, you identify the units of measurements. So and then you collect data and all of that stuff. So the steps are typically the same, but there are slight variations in how you collect data. So those little variations are things that you should pay attention to. And the answer for this is how do you use content analysis? It's on page 113. So we'll just jump over to 113 and see what that looks like. Oh, there we go. So when you go here, so right at the last, at the end of the paragraph, you have bulleted items from 1 through, I believe, 14 or whatever it is. And those are your steps to what you need to do to set yourself up for content analysis. Okay, there are about 7 different things, what your unit of analysis is, and so on. Okay. Now, the next question we have is, what is the problem of validity? What's the issue with validity in all of these different studies that we're using for qualitative work? And the answer to that is in the section regarding validity. And the example they have, so let's quickly look at the example they have. So for example, your textbook presents an example on, I believe, the use of uranium. Let's see if we can find that. Oh, no, never mind. Different course. They're talking about the increase in married women in the workforce and then the increase in content. Tree, go ahead.
So yeah, they use absence of disease. Is that a valid indicator of health?
Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, that's what they're using here. So so the issue of validity is, does it apply? And when you look at the absence of disease as a measure of health, not consistently, right? And oftentimes not applicable. It is a variable, but it's not consistent enough. It doesn't capture the entire concept of health. Is a measure of health cardiovascular fitness. Is it muscular strength? Is it power? Is it flexibility? And they're all variables that kind of capture portions of this large concept we call health. And this doesn't even take the mental health aspect into consideration. This doesn't take sexual health into consideration in any of those things. So the issue with validity is we have to understand that it needs to represent the concept as completely as possible. And this is something that, so the information on whether something, a measure is valid, you can get it from experts in the field, you can get it from other literature, you can also get it from, sorry, I'm just flipping through because I know the next concept. Go ahead, Tree.
I have a question.
Go ahead, yeah.
About validity. So if you wanted your
I'm going to turn my video off. Tree, you
measures
cut out
to
for a
be
second.
valid, but there was no single. Oh, would you ask several different questions in order to get at validity in some cases?
Yes, 100%, because especially when you acknowledge that there's a limitation in your ability to measure a concept completely by measuring a single variable, you almost would have no choice to be truly honest to ourselves as researchers. We almost have to ask more than one question to go after a certain concept, each of them measuring a different variable. And we might have to end up deciding a threshold that unless I have an answer in the affirmative for, say, 3 of the 5 variables that I'm measuring for this concept, I cannot say that it is there, this concept is actually changing. Does that make sense? So let's say health. Okay. Tree said absence of disease, right? Let's say exercise. Let's say score on, let's say polypharmacy. Let's say, what else do we want to say? Well, let's pretend that we are measuring the concept of health. And then in order to measure health, we are using all of these as separate variable measurements for the same concept. And what we decide is we're going to consider people healthy who have an acceptable score on 3 out of the 4. Okay. Then the way we are asking, the way we create validity in our measure is improved. Obviously, it's not perfect, and that's something we'd have to explain in our limitations of our study, saying, although we measured A, B, and C, we recognize that there's always E and F that's also applicable, and we were unable to measure it, or we didn't get strong enough responses for those things. Does that make sense? Okay, well, I'm not hearing anything, so yep, Tree says thumbs up, so we're good. Okay, super. Reliability is a little bit different. Reliability is the ability, Suzanne says yes. Reliability is the ability to get the same response considering the context of what you're asking. So for example, I mean, the example they have in your textbook is when you're measuring the weight of an infant. If you have 10 students who weigh the same baby, even on different scales, and there's a range within which that baby's weight is, and you have 10 other students do the same thing, if all the scales work within a certain range, they are reliable regardless of who's using it. So that's reliability. It's a little bit different. And if we use the same example of health, and we position different variables that we're going to measure. I think we said absence of disease. We said polypharmacy. I think we said minutes of physical activity. Per week or whatever that might be. And then we set scores on an MMSE, which is the mini mental status exam. Oops. So reliability is the idea that if you were to say that I'm going to have questions relating to A, B, C, and D on my questionnaire, and if anyone has poor scores in any 3 of the 4, we are going to consider them to not be in good health. Reliability is no matter who it is, when you administer that sheet to them and 3 out of the 4 are not a good score, you can confidently say that they're not in good health. It is consistent, it fits, okay? If you ask them, would you consider yourself in good health? They can probably triangulate that saying, no, I don't consider myself in good health. And that's reliability, being able to consistently get that answer. So every time, and another way to look at it is no matter who administers that sheet asking these specific questions, you're going to get the same sets of answers from the same sets of individuals. So there are multiple measures of reliability as well, just as you can do with validity. So reliability is basically consistency in being able to get that same result no matter who asks the question. Okay. All right, I think we may be done with that section. So, okay, very good. All right, we move on to the next lecture. Stop share here. Questions, concerns, any specific comments about chapter 7? Okay, seeing none.
I have one.
Oh, go ahead, Dana.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, never mind. Sorry, Tree, go ahead. I misunderstood. Tree, go ahead.
I thought we just reviewed chapter 6 and we're now going into chapter 7.
Yes, sorry, I'm confusing my lecture numbers and my chapter numbers. My lectures are, this is lecture 7, but chapter 6.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yep, no, don't mind me. I will have my lectures not necessarily labeled the same way from time to time, but yeah, we're not skipping ahead on any chapter. So yeah, that could happen. All right. Okay, so this is actually chapter 7, but you will probably see it on D2L as lecture 8. I think that's how I've set it up. So I will share my screen in a second. Let's do this. There we go. Share screen. Okay. Okay, so this chapter is specifically about selecting a research design. You know, one of the first questions we have, and we briefly addressed it, I believe, in chapter 4, is whether we pick qualitative or quantitative, and it completely depends on the questions that we want to ask and the type of information that we want to collect. Some questions need deep, rich, descriptive data that you can only get from interviews and narratives. So really no point in going the quantitative route. It's not going to be helpful. It means you're working with a small group or an individual or a couple of individuals. Other times we may want to get more general information, numerical data. Qualitative data typically looks at groups with very specific characteristics. So for example, if you're looking at older adults who are dealing with the COVID pandemic in long-term care. It's a very specific subset of the larger older adult population. Typically what happens is you can start with one kind of study and then you can move on to another. And that happens as well. People will do mixed methods where they use both qualitative and quantitative research. So for example, if we can study older adults immigrating to Canada in many different ways. We can go all statistical and go to Stats Canada, we'll get some numbers there. Or we can understand why a lot of older adults stay in Canada and others just prefer to visit. Some older adults will remain. They will immigrate to Canada and some won't. I'll give an example. I have cousins whose families, older adults, have all migrated to the US. That's where their younger children are. But in my generation, the older adults are quite independent with strong pensions and family roots and ties, and so they won't leave India to come and live for an extended period of time. And if we want to understand that, really, I mean, is it proximity to family and social ties and connections and identity and how they see themselves? That's not something we can get out of statistical data. There's an example in your textbook about Lebo's tally corner. So this was during the heights of the civil rights movement. Poverty in African Americans was at an all-time high. I don't know that it's much. There are many marginalized Black Americans in the U.S. still, but anyway, poverty was exceptionally high at the heights of the civil rights movement. So Lebo was a white man who wanted to understand what it meant to be Black and live in poverty. So he went in with no preconceived idea. And he lived with Black families so that he could develop questions as his interviews progressed regarding their day-to-day lives. Typically, when you start to ask for a relationship between variables, that is your quantitative, then that's when you want to look at quantitative research, and that's the design we need to use. You try to relate one to the other. It's correlational or causal or not related at all. And those three tend to typically be what it is. So, the more you study, yep, okay, well, there we go. The more you study, the better academic performance you have. Yeah, that's a cause. We're suggesting a cause and an effect there. This may or may not be a cause and effect relationship here. The number of hours spent studying and your exam results, okay, and they may not be associated. I just, of course, I made a positive sign here and drew an arrow. But again, if you wanted to ask the question and you wanted to even determine that there isn't a relationship, you'd still have to go in with a quantitative approach. So the point is, even if you are looking at the existence or the non-existence of a relationship between two variables, you'd still have to use a quantitative approach to do that. And again, this is operationalizing the same thing, number of times, specifically number of hours spent studying and marks on the exam. There are different types of relationships, so we just mentioned that. Association is typically easy to prove. For example, good marks are associated with hours of study, but they're not necessarily causal because people's ability, aptitude, intelligence, time, good mental health, circumstances, having the right textbook, having, not being exhausted while preparing for a test. All of those things are factors. So unless you can control for all of those, you can't really say that there's a cause and effect. More hours equals more marks. You can have internal comparisons. So assuming the person is healthy in 2 different points of time and they're taking comparable exams and they've studied in one case and not studied in the other, yeah, there can be a cause and effect in that situation because there's an internal control there. So one of the key things to remember is this term of control variables. Control variables are very hard to do, particularly in case of what we consider natural experiments. So for example, there is an increased number of deaths all over the world due to non-COVID related causes because of limitations posed upon people from entering into the ER or to come to the hospital. So lots of people are ignoring things like pain in the chest, cancers, all of these things, just because typically you'd go and address it, but then you don't want to go to the hospital because it's quite restrictive. You have to get swabbed, A, B, C, and the other thing. So it's causing a lot of collateral damage, so to speak. And so the issue here is, even though that's an observation, we can't really control the variables because every individual is different and the health outcomes are different. So we don't really know that there's a cause and effect. It's an observation. Oftentimes variables are associated, just like this example that we spoke of. Neither association nor cause and effect are pure coincidence, and there's statistical tests that help you identify whether one thing causing the other is pure chance, or whether one thing happening and the other thing could have simply been a chance event. So examples of non-causal events, calories and weight gain. So two people might consume the same calories, but they may not necessarily, both might not gain the same weight. Some people have a different basal metabolic rate. They will burn more calories, and some people have a different basal metabolic rate. It also depends on the amount of activity that each person may be engaged in. And you may even start off with people being the same size, similar age, and they might have completely different experiences in terms of food consumption. Mental health and stress. Does stress cause more mental health challenges? And again, that's a hard one because people come with different mental health statuses, different coping skills, strategies, and capacities. So stress might cause distress or difficulty for a lot of people. But for some people who are used to handling stress and used to have good stress management skills, that might not be a big deal. Does the amount of income determine whether you are in debt? No, it doesn't. People often, people who make large incomes accumulate larger amounts of debt. This is also quite common because when you earn more, there is a feeling that, well, I can pay it off, and then you take more risk, more debt, and so on. And again, then we're just giving examples of non-causal relationships which appear to be related, but they actually aren't. Now, in your textbook, you have a bunch of research designs that they talk about. I'm not sure how clear this is on your screen. If you can't see it, we'll go over to the textbook. Just let me know in the chat window if you can't see this. 2 comments in the chat window. I'm just going to open that up. Okay, these are old comments. Very good. Okay. Steph says she can see it. Very good. So there are different kinds of research design. This is something called a simple case study, where you're looking at one situation that you're interested in studying. For example, you want to find out what's going on with let's say the soda pop machine at the long-term care facility that you work at. It's available to employees, and they put in cash, get their stuff. Simple case studies are limited in scope, that they're studying a singular situation. A case study can be as simple as working with one resident. Okay, working with one resident, perhaps using a certain type of music that helps manage their responsive behaviors, and you go ahead and you write what you did, obviously with consent and following all ethical protocols, and you have success, so you report it. It can be as simple as that. A case study can be a little more complex in the sense you're looking, let's say you're at Extendicare York, say maybe like Tree, or Misha, you work in one of the long-term care facilities. You might want to make an observation study of what kind of food is preferred by people, or what kind of candy people prefer for, for getting their sugar high and so on. And all those would come under the broad umbrella of case studies. What is happening here? The case studies typically don't try to suggest a causal relationship. They are mostly observational, and they provide very, very simplistic answers. The second type of study is the longitudinal study. Now, you've seen examples of all of this in research literacy as well, but it's a good idea to take a look at these again. A longitudinal study, typically anytime the word longitudinal comes in, your x-axis on that study is going to be time, because you're looking at stuff over time. So, in the example, it says time A and time B, but it could be over a continuous stretch of time. Cassidy says, on my end, you keep freezing on me, but I keep getting random clear moments. All right, Cassidy, I'm not sure how to help. I'm going to do my best. I have my video off. I have to have my audio on. Well, it's all getting recorded. So if you can track what you're missing, Ireland says it's working clear for me. One of the things, perhaps not right now, to do after class is to check your internet speed. Now, when Catherine, you say same for me, am I freezing on you or is it clear for you? Catherine says clear, okay. And I recognize that is a reality for a lot of us. Our Cassidy says, I think I'm able to track what's going on. Okay, very good. I mean, just remember that all of these lectures go online. So if you miss stuff, if you missed a concept, missed an idea, just go ahead and just note down the time where you missed stuff. Because, for example, it's 45 minutes into the lecture. You probably don't want to watch 45 minutes of the same stuff to get to the point where you miss stuff. So anytime you miss stuff, just write down the time, like just the time on your clock on your computer. Say it's 12:27 p.m. Just write down your time. And 12:27 is about roughly an hour from 11:30. So you can scroll forward on your YouTube video, get to that point, and just view that section, and it'll all fit in. Okay, and I apologize. This is not on my end. This is the internet doing what it does. Okay, so anyway, hang in there. Longitudinal study is over time, so you're not necessarily looking at just one or two time points. It may be multiple time points. Let's pick an interesting concept for Sudbury. Let's say number of LGBTQ older adults in long-term care. So this is where we're talking about self-identified LGBTQ2+. And we have 1, 2, 3. We'll just pretend that this is these are individual numbers, and let's say these are 1980s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and 20s. And let's just pretend that these are average numbers. And so if you were to kind of make a curve or a trend line, kind of looks something like this. Okay. So it's basically a change over a period of time. That's what a longitudinal study is all about. Okay. I don't know if I can erase this thing. Anyway, the opposite of a longitudinal study is a comparison study. A comparison study is essentially, you're not looking at things through the window of time. You're looking at it as what's happening right now in the moment, just this minute. A classic example of a comparison study is I look at my class of research method 2 students. I have 17 students in class, and I'm looking at their final mark. So I'm not looking at how students have done throughout the course. I'm just looking at their final mark as a snapshot, and I have an average class mark and so on. So that's a comparison study. I'm comparing 17 different students' marks. Okay, so that's a singular study comparing home prices in different cities. Those are all examples of comparison studies. How are they different? Okay. A longitudinal comparison, as you can imagine, is a logical extension of longitudinal and comparison studies. So what that asks is, if you're looking at home prices of different cities, what it's saying is, if this is your time, because there is a longitudinal component. So let's say 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, 2020. If you're comparing the median home price, different cities, let's say Sudbury is represented by a clear line. Let's say North Bay. I like our northern cities, starts at a lower threshold. It's got the little dotted line. Let's take Barrie. Barrie is not a northern city, but it's closer to Toronto. Let's say we make it a little curvy line. Okay, so I'm just representing the final findings. I'm not saying this is how you should conduct the study. This is an example of the final observation. So this would be an example of a longitudinal comparison studies, because not only are you comparing 3 different cities and the median home price, you're also comparing that over a period of time. That's what a longitudinal comparison is. And finally, what you have is an experiment. An experimental study basically asks the question that if you start, so in an experimental study, you need to have an experimental group and you need to have a control group. Okay, a control group is, you don't do anything for the control group. Okay, so for example, when they did the human trials for the COVID vaccine, they had an experimental group and a control group. So the experimental group was given the vaccine. Okay, a bunch of randomly chosen people, basically they must have controlled for a bunch of things. So they're picked people of similar age, similar health status, which means probably people without underlying conditions. What else? Let's just pretend that these are 2 of the factors that they controlled for, okay? They may have done it by gender. Okay, so they might have compared women to women and men to men. Because gender-based responses do exist, so it's 100% logical to do it that way. Okay, you can't assume that you would. So, for example, a classic example is the presentation of a heart attack or a cardiac arrest. Men and women present cardiac arrest very, very differently. So when you get admitted to an ER, if all you know is how men present with a heart attack, you're not going to identify women having a heart attack. Okay, so you have to know. That's why you have to compare women to women and men to men as well for several situations. Anyway, in the case of this vaccine, what would happen is one group, let's say B group, the control group, does not get the intervention. Okay, so this little arrow here, that's the intervention. The experimental group gets the intervention, and once they have had the vaccine, they get tested for their blood and they look for antibodies. They look for antibodies against corona. Okay. They do the same thing here, even though they had no injection, or they had an injection which was just saline. They're still going to check anti-COVID-19. And really what should happen is, if the vaccine is effective, you should see antibodies here and none here, okay? So the cause and the effect, the vaccine caused a presence of antibodies against coronavirus. So the cause and effect is very easy to determine in an experiment. And the step where you do the change or you introduce something is called the intervention, okay? So the intervention is, in this case, is the use of the vaccine. Sometimes we have natural experiments that occur as well. You have a population, there's a before and after. You can do experiments several ways. You don't always get to have a control group. So sometimes you have to do a before and after experiment. So what happens is, for example, you might have people who have high blood cholesterol due to their obesity. They have higher levels of cholesterol, poor activity, and then they go through an exercise program and you measure all their blood parameters later, and they're all much lower and back at healthier levels. That's a before and after type experiment. And in this case, the good thing is you don't have to control for anything because it's the exact same people before and after. So you're kind of saved from having to find a very controlled group. The good thing about an experiment is that you can always point to causality. It's no more speculation. You see the cause and the effect. So let's look at case study. How are we doing on time? We have 15 minutes, so that's good. Okay. Okay. So the focus of a case study, like we said, it's not just an individual person, it can be on an institution. So if you're trying to identify transportation challenges in Chelmsford and Sudbury, or in Levack or Onaping, which are kind of outlying communities, it would still be a case study. A case study can be qualitative or quantitative. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be one. It can be the other, or it can be a combination too. You might have a little interview component. For example, if you are interested in looking at, I'm just saying Extendicare York because that name comes first to me. If you're trying to identify what the use of certain snacks in the vending machine, okay, and there's similar examples in your textbook, and you're looking at how employees use them, you might have a checklist on which you kind of have listed all the candies or all the goodies that your machine has to offer. You may even take a picture of your vending machine, and these might be all the items on your vending machine. And this, you might just use that as a data collection sheet because it's really very efficient. So you might go ahead and you might make check marks around which item is disappearing and which ones remain, and so on. You might have a bunch of sheets, you may summarize, and you may get a very good quantitative answer. But you might be interested in knowing why people pick certain snack items, and you might go ahead and have a qualitative comparison or qualitative questionnaire to deal with that as well. Typically in a case study, there's no cause or effect. There's no hypothesis to be tested. You're mostly trying to understand what's going on. And case studies can be used to test previous relationships. So for example, a case study might be used to figure out if a student is doing better if they are studying more, if they're spending more time on their courses. Perhaps there's already a study indicating that when students study more, they perform better in exams. Anyway. This is so this is more on, we have an example of two vending machines at a country club frequented by older adults. Machine one dispenses pop and the other carbonated beverages. Pop and other carbonated beverages. Machine two dispenses fruit juice. We find that machine one gets emptied more often than machine two. Now, at first sight, it might appear that older adults visiting the club make poor health choices. But then as you're studying the case, you understand as you speak to them that half of them don't know where machine two is. Machine one is right at the reception of the country club. Machine two is in a part of the hallway. It's not immediately apparent. And again, it's, so there might be more things that you understand from a case study. Just getting down the numbers might not be sufficient. So this is just an example I tossed in there so that you understand that a case study does not have to be limited in just documenting numbers and commenting about them. Longitudinal study, invariably, it's, you have an X and Y axis relationship, and usually if it's longitudinal, this is a time axis. It can be different axes too. It doesn't necessarily have to be time. It can be a number of events. So it might be that the number of times the number of pitches you face in a pitching machine. Say you want to improve in baseball, your timing's not good. The number of times you face that, your timing improves and you're able to hit the ball. Or you're learning how to play tennis and your forehand is not good, but the more balls you hit on your forehand improves. So it doesn't have to be time, it can be the number of events. So maybe this is 100 balls that you hit, maybe this is 200 balls that you hit, this is 300, 400 and so on. And this is, say, accuracy of forehand. So let's say percentage accuracy of forehand. And obviously, the more balls you hit, your accuracy improves. Okay, so it can be over time. It usually is over time, a longitudinal study, but it can also be a number of incidents. And the reason I bring that example to you is so that when you encounter studies where they don't necessarily have a time scale, and they still talk about it as a longitudinal study, it's not creating confusion. Examples of longitudinal studies is, flexibility in the body, bank balance, number of social relationships over time, number of births, deaths, weight loss, etc. You'll notice that some of these examples are not causal. For example, with increase in time, you don't have to increase or decrease social relationships. They might not be related. Okay, your bank balance might not be related. You're flexible, so you have to remember that depending on the context, they may or may not be relational. Okay. Longitudinal studies can also be pre and post testing sensitization over time. So for example, if there were surveys, attitudinal surveys for ageism for students before they entered the gerontology program and they got a certain score, and you had that survey or similar surveys administered over a 4-year period, students graduating out of the gerontology program should probably by the end of the second year should be relatively less ageist than they initially started out on. Okay. Comparison study, as we said, it is more one thing versus the other. You're not looking at time, and examples can be you're comparing all season tires versus winter tires in terms of braking distance. You can look at English proficiency and unemployment. You can do that over different locations, different time points, and so on. And of course, longitudinal comparison is an addition of both of those things. Now, we have 8 minutes more, but I'd rather not get into the questions this class. I'll save them for next class. But what I'll do now is I will stop sharing here and ask you folks if you have questions, concerns, comments. Everybody good so far? Cassidy says no. Okay, very good. I hope everyone's reading your textbooks because it's impossible for me to go word by word for each chapter or go over everything that's in your textbook. I don't think it helps anybody because I just think I would need like 3 semesters to finish the textbook if I did that. But it's much more efficient if I talk to you about the concepts and ideas and you do the reading yourself. That makes it better. And it's also good preparation for your midterm. Your midterm is in March, almost like the 3rd week in March, I think. Your midterm and your final aren't probably separated by too much, probably by a few weeks. But the good thing is if you prepare hard for the midterm, you are probably mostly prepared for the final too. So it's 2 birds, 1 stone kind of deal. So that's a good thing. Most of you have been pretty good at class participation, but if I have a hard time, I have notes for most students. I haven't missed anybody, I don't think. But if I have a hard time remembering what you said last in any of my classes, then you are in a little bit of trouble for sure. Regarding that component of the course. Some of you have been very, very good at emailing questions and comments regarding what you learned, and I appreciate that. It's all going into my notes, and so I know who's participating, who's on track. The participation component is important in the sense that you're actively engaging with the material, not simply preparing for exams. And this is in terms of improving your overall education by the time you get your degree and you leave. You know, it has to have meaning to it. So that's the whole idea. All right, I'm done. I'm getting off my soapbox, but comments, questions? If nothing, then you are all free to go.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Most welcome. Thanks, Cassidy.